In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard stood in the ruins of an ancient palace in what is now Iraq. His workers had just uncovered something extraordinary. Clay tablets, thousands of them, covered in wedge-shaped marks that no one had seen in over 2,000 years. What he didn't know, what no one could have known, was that these tablets were about to rewrite everything the world believed about the Bible. Picture this. For centuries, Genesis was considered the oldest account of creation, the original story, God's direct revelation to humanity. Churches built their entire foundation on this. But buried in the dust of Mesopotamia was evidence of something impossible. These tablets described creation, a great flood, the origins of humanity, and they were written over 1,000 years before Genesis. The implications were staggering. If the Bible wasn't original, then what was it? An edited version? A copy of older stories? And if that's true, what else might have been changed? Here's what makes this discovery so explosive. The tablets came from the library of King Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian ruler who lived around 650 BCE. He was obsessed with collecting knowledge. His scribes copied everything they could find: ancient wisdom, creation myths, astronomical records, flood narratives. They preserved texts that were already ancient when they wrote them down. Some of these stories dated back to 2100 BCE or earlier. That's more than a millennium before the oldest parts of Genesis were written. When scholars finally translated these tablets in the 1870s, they found something shocking. The Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation epic that parallels Genesis in ways that can't be coincidence. Both describe the separation of waters and dry land. Both feature the creation of humanity from divine essence mixed with earth. Both place humans in a garden-like paradise. The structures match, the sequences align, even specific phrases echo each other.
But here's where it gets interesting.
The Enuma Elish isn't just similar to Genesis. It's more complex, more detailed. It describes multiple gods, cosmic battles, and the explicit purpose for creating humans, to serve as workers for the gods. Genesis simplifies all of this. One God, clean creation, no cosmic conflict, no mention of humans as divine servants. It's like someone took a sprawling epic and condensed it into a theological summary. Then there's the flood story. In 1872, a young scholar named George Smith was examining tablets from Ashurbanipal's library when he came across something that made him jump up and, according to witnesses, start tearing off his clothes in excitement. He'd found the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in it, a flood narrative so similar to Noah's Ark that it couldn't be ignored. Let me tell you the details. In the Babylonian version, a man named Utnapishtim receives warning of a coming flood from the god Ea. He's told to build a massive boat and load it with animals and seeds. The flood comes. It destroys all life. The boat lands on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds to test if the waters have receded. First a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. After the flood, he makes a sacrifice, and the gods gather around the offering like flies. Then a rainbow appears as a sign. Sound familiar? Because that's essentially the Noah story. The ark dimensions, the animals, the birds sent out in the same order, the sacrifice, the rainbow covenant. These aren't vague parallels. These are specific narrative details that match point by point. And the Babylonian version was written at least 500 years before Genesis. When these discoveries hit the academic world in the late 1800s, It created a crisis. Religious institutions had built their authority on the claim that the Bible was unique, divine revelation. Now, archaeologists were presenting evidence that biblical narratives borrowed from earlier pagan myths. The implications were devastating.
If Genesis wasn't original, was it still divinely inspired? Or was it simply an edited collection of older cultural stories? The initial response from religious authorities was denial. Some claimed the tablets were forgeries. Others argued that the Mesopotamian stories were corrupted versions of an original true account preserved only in the Bible. But as more tablets were discovered and translated by multiple independent scholars, denial became impossible. The evidence was overwhelming. The Mesopotamian texts were definitely older. The parallels were definitely real. Something had to give. Now, here's what most people don't realize. Mainstream biblical scholars today openly acknowledge these connections. This isn't fringe conspiracy theory. It's documented academic consensus. Researchers like Mark Smith at New York University have spent decades studying how Israelite religion evolved from earlier Canaanite traditions. His work, published by major academic presses, shows how Genesis compresses older polytheistic myths into monotheistic narratives. Multiple gods become one god. Divine councils are edited out. Complex mythologies are streamlined into simplified theology. Take Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Let us make man in our image. Who is us? Traditional interpretation says God is using a royal plural. But scholars point out that earlier versions of these creation stories featured councils of gods debating and collaborating. The us is a linguistic fossil, a trace of earlier polytheistic texts that later editors didn't fully remove. Archaeological discoveries keep reinforcing this pattern. At Ugarit in Syria, excavators found an entire library of texts from around 1200 BCE describing Canaanite religion. There's El, the father god. There's Baal, the storm deity. There's Asherah, the mother goddess. And there's a divine council where these beings meet and make decisions. This is the religious context that Israelite religion emerged from. Genesis didn't appear in a vacuum. It was written by people immersed in Canaanite culture, adapting and transforming those earlier stories for their own theological purposes. But adaptation means editing, and editing means choices about what to keep and what to cut. The process is called redaction criticism in biblical scholarship. Experts study how texts were compiled, which sources were used, what got emphasized, and what got suppressed. They can identify different writing styles, different theological perspectives, and different historical layers, all woven together in the biblical text. For example, Genesis contains two different creation accounts that don't quite match. Chapter 1 has humans created last, male and female together. Chapter 2 has the man created first, then animals, then woman from his rib. Why the contradiction? Because they're from different source texts, compiled by later editors who preserved both versions despite the inconsistency. What else got edited? That's the question scholars keep asking. We know goddess worship was widespread in ancient Israel, despite official prohibition. Archaeological excavations have found thousands of female deity figurines in Israelite homes. Inscriptions at Kuntilet Ajrud mention Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting the God of Israel once had a divine consort. But the biblical text systematically erases this. Goddesses are condemned as foreign corruption. The feminine divine disappears from the official narrative. Translation adds another layer of complexity. Cuneiform symbols can be read multiple ways depending on context. A single sign might represent a syllable, a word, or a concept. Scholars argue endlessly about proper interpretation. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Translation is never neutral. Every translator makes choices based on their assumptions, their training, their theological commitments. What they expect to find shapes what they see in the text. This creates a problem.
If ancient texts can be interpreted different ways, and if religious authorities have strong incentives to interpret them in ways that support existing doctrine, how do we know we're getting accurate translations? How do we know what's being emphasized and what's being minimized? The academic establishment has one set of answers. They use peer review, multiple independent translations, and rigorous methodology to establish consensus. Alternative researchers have different answers. They argue that institutional gatekeeping prevents radical reinterpretations from getting serious consideration. Both sides accuse the other of bias. Academia says alternative researchers ignore evidence and cherry-pick translations. Alternative researchers say academia is protecting orthodox narratives. But here's what can't be disputed. Ancient Mesopotamian texts predate Genesis by centuries or millennia. The parallels are real and documented. Biblical narratives were not created in isolation, but emerged from a rich Near Eastern cultural context. And religious institutions have historically responded to archaeological discoveries that challenge traditional beliefs, with patterns ranging from denial to defensive reinterpretation. The question isn't whether editing happened. Scholars confirm it did. The question is, what else was edited? Why? And by whom? What made it into the biblical text, and what got left on the cutting room floor? Which stories were preserved, and which were buried? In 2021, new translations published in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies revealed additional details in Mesopotamian flood narratives that never made it into Genesis. Ritual sacrifices performed during the voyage, specific prayers to multiple gods, technical specifications for the ark's construction, all absent from the biblical version. Were these details deemed too polytheistic, too technical, too revealing of the source material? The theological implications are profound. If the Bible borrowed from earlier myths, does that diminish its authority? Or does it show how ancient peoples preserved and transmitted important cultural memories across generations? If Genesis was edited and adapted, does that make it less divine? Or does it reveal how human institutions shape religious narratives to serve specific purposes? And here's the real question that should make everyone uncomfortable. We know about these Mesopotamian texts because archaeologists dug them up and scholars translated them. But how many other ancient texts existed that we never found? How many were deliberately destroyed? How many are still locked away in archives where only certain researchers with certain credentials are allowed access? For over a century, the Vatican maintained what it called the Vatican Secret Archive, 53 miles of shelving containing documents spanning 1,200 years. Until 2019, that was the official name, secret. Now it's called the Apostolic Archive, but the restrictions remain. Certain documents require special permissions. Some files are still sealed. What's in there that relates to ancient creation myths? What did Renaissance scholars working in Vatican libraries discover about connections between biblical narratives and pagan sources? We know religious institutions have historically suppressed information that threatened doctrine. The trial of Galileo, the index of forbidden books that banned texts for 4 centuries, the systematic destruction of indigenous records during colonization. Information control isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented historical pattern. So, when we find ancient tablets that predate and parallel Genesis, we have to ask the uncomfortable questions. Who decided which ancient stories would become scripture and which would be forgotten? Who edited the texts, And what were their agendas? What happened to the original unedited versions?
And most importantly, if the Bible's foundational stories were adapted from older Mesopotamian sources, what else might have been edited, omitted, or deliberately suppressed? And who decided which parts of humanity's ancient heritage would be preserved and which would disappear into institutional archives? Because in 1976, one man claimed to have answers. Controversial answers. Shocking answers. He said the ancient texts describe something that religious authorities desperately wanted to hide. He said the Mesopotamian tablets tell a story about human origins that would shake the foundations of everything we've been taught. And it all starts with beings called the Anunnaki. His name was Zecharia Sitchin, and what he discovered in those ancient clay tablets would make the Vatican's secrets look like footnotes to history. His name was Zecharia Sitchin, and whether he was a prophet or a fraud, he did something that changed everything. He made people look at ancient texts and ask, what if we've been reading them wrong? So we've discovered that Genesis borrowed from older Mesopotamian sources. We know ancient tablets describe creation and floods centuries before the Bible. But here's the question everyone's really asking. What do those older texts actually say? What stories existed before the editing, before the simplification, before religious authorities decided which version we'd be allowed to read? Sitchin claimed he had the answer, and it was stranger than anyone imagined. Zecharia Sitchin wasn't supposed to become famous. Born in Azerbaijan in 1920, raised in Palestine, educated in economics at the London School of Economics, he seemed destined for a quiet career in journalism and business. He worked as an editor. He ran a shipping company. Nothing about his resume suggested he would one day challenge the entire foundation of human history. But Sitchin had an obsession: ancient languages, specifically Sumerian cuneiform.
While his peers were analyzing markets and writing business reports, Sitchin spent his evenings teaching himself to read clay tablets that were 4,000 years old. No professor guided him. No university trained him. He just sat with dictionaries, reference texts, and photographs of ancient inscriptions, slowly, painstakingly decoding wedge-shaped symbols that hadn't been understood for millennia. For 30 years he studied. For 30 years he built a theory that would eventually explode into popular consciousness. And in 1976, he finally published his findings in a book called The 12th Planet. The central claim was audacious. Sitchin argued that roughly 450,000 years ago, beings from a planet called Nibiru arrived on Earth. These beings, called the Anunnaki in Sumerian texts, came here for a specific reason: gold. They needed it to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. So, they established settlements in Mesopotamia, set up mining operations in Africa, and began extracting the precious metal. But mining is hard work, exhausting, dangerous. According to Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, the Anunnaki workers eventually rebelled. They went on strike, refused to dig anymore. This created a crisis. The mission was failing, so the Anunnaki scientists came up with a solution. They would create workers, not robots, not slaves brought from their home world, but a new species, engineered specifically for labor. They took the genetic material from early hominids already living on Earth creatures like Homo erectus, and combined it with their own DNA. The result was Homo sapiens, us. According to Sitchin, we weren't the product of slow natural selection over millions of years. We were the product of deliberate genetic engineering, created by extraterrestrial scientists, designed to mine gold for alien overlords. Now here's where it gets really controversial.
Sitchin claimed that the Sumerian word Anunnaki literally means those who from heaven to earth came. He argued that ancient scribes weren't writing mythology or religious allegory. They were documenting history, recording actual events, preserving the memory of when advanced beings descended from the sky and transformed human civilization. The academic response was swift and brutal. Trained Assyriologists, scholars who spent decades studying Mesopotamian languages, tore into Sitchin's translations. Michael Heiser, a biblical scholar with expertise in ancient languages, wrote detailed refutations showing how Sitchin's interpretations were fundamentally flawed. The word Anunnaki, scholars pointed out, doesn't mean those who came from heaven. It more accurately translates to princely offspring or offspring of royal seed. Sitchin, they argued, had twisted grammar, ignored context, and cherry-picked meanings to support his predetermined conclusions. Other experts piled on. They showed how Sitchin would take a Sumerian term with multiple possible meanings and always choose the interpretation that fit his alien theory, even when that meaning made no sense in context. He treated metaphorical language as literal description. He connected texts from different time periods as if they were a single coherent narrative, ignoring the evolution of Mesopotamian religion over centuries. To the academic establishment, Sitchin was a pseudo-scholar, an amateur who didn't understand the basics of the languages he claimed to translate. His work wasn't research. It was science fiction dressed up with footnotes. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Sitchin wasn't completely wrong about everything. His pattern recognition, his ability to connect dots across different ancient texts, was actually quite sophisticated. He noticed that Sumerian astronomical knowledge was remarkably advanced. They knew about planets that shouldn't have been visible to the naked eye. They described orbital mechanics with surprising accuracy. They mapped celestial events in ways that suggested access to information far beyond what simple observation should have provided. Sitchin also noticed genealogies in Genesis that aligned with Sumerian king lists. He found architectural similarities between ancient sites separated by thousands of miles. He identified technological descriptions in myths, flying vehicles, powerful weapons, genetic manipulation, that seemed oddly specific for purely imaginative stories. Was he connecting real patterns, or was he seeing patterns where none existed? That's the question that divides people. Think about it this way. Throughout history, outsiders have occasionally made discoveries that overturned academic consensus. Heinrich Schliemann was a businessman with no formal archaeological training who used Homer's Iliad as a literal guide to find Troy. Experts said he was wasting his time chasing myths. He proved them wrong by excavating the actual city. Alfred Wegener was a meteorologist who proposed that continents drift across Earth's surface. Geologists mocked him for decades, called him a crank, dismissed his evidence. Eventually, plate tectonics proved he was right. So does Sitchin belong in this category, the amateur outsider who saw what credentialed experts missed? Or is he more like Erich von Däniken, the ancient astronaut theorist who made sensational claims that fell apart under scrutiny? Here's what we can say for certain. Sitchin's linguistic interpretations are demonstrably flawed. Professional Assyriologists have shown this repeatedly. His translation of Anunnaki is wrong. His reading of specific texts is often incorrect. His methodology, taking symbols out of context, ignoring grammatical rules, wouldn't pass peer review in any academic journal. But that doesn't mean all his questions are invalid. It doesn't mean everything he noticed was meaningless. Consider the gold mining claim. At first,
It sounds absurd. Why would an advanced civilization need to mine gold from Earth? But hold on. Gold has unique properties. It's one of the best conductors of electricity. It doesn't corrode or tarnish. It reflects radiation. Modern spacecraft use gold foil for thermal protection. Electronics rely on gold connections for reliability. Nanotechnology research published in Nature Communications has shown how gold particles can stabilize molecular structures in ways no other element can replicate. So the idea that an advanced civilization might value gold for technological rather than decorative purposes, that's not actually crazy. It's scientifically plausible. Then there's the genetic engineering claim. In 1976, when Sitchin published his book, genetic engineering was theoretical. Test tube babies were still 2 years away. Cloning was science fiction. CRISPR hadn't even been discovered yet. The idea of deliberately modifying genomes seemed impossible. Today, it's routine. We engineer bacteria to produce insulin. We create crops with desired traits. We edit human embryos to remove genetic diseases. Chinese scientists shocked the world in 2018 by creating gene-edited babies. What seemed impossible in 1976 is now high school biology lab-level technology. Does that make Sitchin right? No. But it changes the context. It makes the questions he asked less absurd and more uncomfortable. And those questions tap into something powerful. We're living in an era where space exploration isn't fantasy anymore. We've discovered thousands of exoplanets. We've detected organic molecules in interstellar space. Scientists seriously discuss the Fermi paradox. Why haven't we encountered alien civilizations if the universe is so vast? Programs like SETI actively search for extraterrestrial intelligence. In this context, ancient astronaut theories don't sound as ridiculous as they once did. If intelligent life exists elsewhere, if interstellar travel is possible, then asking whether ancient humans had contact with advanced beings becomes a legitimate scientific question rather than pure fantasy. This is why Sitchin's work resonated so powerfully with popular audiences, even as academics dismissed it. He was asking questions people wanted answered. He was challenging institutional authority at a time when trust in institutions was declining. He was offering an alternative narrative that made ancient history feel relevant and mysterious and important. But here's the problem with alternative research. Without peer review, without rigorous methodology, without accountability to expert consensus, how do we separate insight from fantasy? How do we tell the difference between a breakthrough discovery and confirmation bias? Sitchin connected dots across ancient texts, but so do conspiracy theorists. He found patterns in Sumerian astronomy, but pattern recognition can create false connections as easily as it reveals hidden truths. The human brain is wired to see patterns, even in random noise. It's called apophenia. We see faces in clouds, hidden messages in coincidences, grand conspiracies in unrelated events. Was Sitchin a victim of apophenia? Or was he genuinely onto something that institutional scholarship refuses to acknowledge? Consider recent discoveries that complicate the narrative. Geneticists have found evidence that human evolution wasn't a simple linear progression. We interbred with Neanderthals. We mixed with Denisovans. There are genetic markers in modern humans that don't match any known ancestral population. Something strange happened in our evolutionary history, something we don't fully understand yet.
In 2010, scientists announced the discovery of a mysterious ancient hominin in Siberia, based entirely on DNA extracted from a finger bone. Denisovans were unknown until we found their genetic signature in living humans. What else might be hiding in our genome?
Sitchin would point to these discoveries as validation. See? Human origins are more complex than the simple evolutionary story. See? There are mysteries in our DNA. But mainstream scientists interpret the same evidence completely differently. They see natural evolutionary processes, not alien intervention. Who's right? And more importantly, how do we decide? This is the real question at the heart of Sitchin's legacy. Not whether his specific claims are correct, but whether the institutional gatekeeping of knowledge serves truth or protects orthodoxy. When academics dismiss alternative researchers without seriously engaging their arguments, does that reflect scientific rigor or defensive dogma? Consider how the academic peer review process actually works. Journals accept papers that fit existing paradigms. Grant funding goes to research that builds incrementally on established models. Scholars who challenge fundamental assumptions risk their careers. Tenure committees don't reward radical thinking. They reward safe, publishable, consensus-aligned research. This system has benefits. It filters out junk science. It maintains standards. It prevents every crackpot with a theory from polluting academic discourse. But it also creates blind spots. It makes paradigm shifts difficult. It punishes outsiders who see things differently. Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, documented this pattern in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Paradigms don't shift because new evidence convinces the old guard. They shift because the old guard retires, and a new generation accepts ideas the previous generation rejected. So, when mainstream Assyriologists dismiss Sitchin, are they protecting legitimate scholarship from pseudoscientific contamination? Or are they defending a paradigm that can't accommodate uncomfortable questions? Here's what we know. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe beings called the Anunnaki, who possessed advanced knowledge.
These beings taught humanity agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and writing. They're consistently described as coming from the heavens. They're portrayed as having power over life and death. They're credited with shaping human civilization. Academic scholars interpret this as mythology, religious personification of natural forces, allegories about social hierarchies, psychological projections of human fears and desires onto cosmic dramas. Sitchin interpreted it as history, literal descriptions, preserved memories, evidence. Both interpretations involve assumptions. Both filter evidence through particular frameworks. Both claim to be following the evidence while actually imposing interpretation onto ambiguous texts. The difference is that one interpretation has institutional backing, and the other doesn't. One is called scholarship, and the other is called pseudo-scholarship. But institutional authority doesn't automatically equal truth. History is full of examples where consensus was wrong, and the lone dissenter was right. So, here's the uncomfortable question we have to face. What if Sitchin was wrong about the details, but right about the core insight? What if ancient texts really do preserve memories of something extraordinary? What if the Anunnaki weren't extraterrestrials from another planet, but they also weren't purely mythological inventions? What if there's a third possibility that both academic orthodoxy and ancient astronaut theory are missing? Because here's what neither side talks about. We know ancient Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki. We know these texts influence the Bible. We know religious authorities have been aware of these connections for over a century. They had access to the tablets. They studied the translations. They understood the implications. So, what did they make of them? What discussions happened behind closed doors in the Vatican, in theological seminaries, in religious institutions around the world?
When scholars first discovered that Genesis borrowed from Babylonian myths, when they realized the Bible wasn't original revelation but an edited compilation, what conversations took place about how to handle this information? Did they see mythology? Or did they see something else? Something more troubling? Something that needed to be carefully managed, reinterpreted, or kept from wider public knowledge? Zecharia Sitchin may have been wrong about extraterrestrials. His translations may have been flawed. His theories may have been speculation dressed as scholarship. But whether he was prophet or pseudo-scholar, he forced us to confront an uncomfortable fact. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe beings with advanced knowledge who shaped human civilization. These descriptions were known to religious authorities for over a century before Sitchin ever published his theories. What did they make of them? And what else do they know that we don't? Because if you want to understand what ancient texts really say about the Anunnaki, if you want to know what's been edited and what's been hidden, there's one place you need to look. Behind walls that have guarded secrets for centuries. In archives that were literally called secret until just a few years ago. The Vatican, where 53 miles of shelving hold documents that could rewrite history, where access is restricted, where certain truths are carefully controlled. What's behind those walls? And why don't they want us to see it? Behind the walls of Vatican City, 53 miles of shelving hold documents spanning 1,200 years. Letters from Michelangelo, requests for annulments from Henry VIII, transcripts from the trial of Galileo, and until 2019, this place had a name that fueled conspiracy theories for decades. The Vatican Secret Archive. Secret. That single word told you everything about how the Catholic Church viewed knowledge.
Some things were meant for scholars with proper credentials and approved research topics. Everything else? Locked away where curious eyes couldn't reach. In 2019, Pope Francis changed the name. Now it's called the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Sounds less ominous, more academic. But here's what didn't change: the restrictions, the permission requirements, the documents that remain sealed even from scholars with Vatican approval. Which raises a very simple question. What don't they want us to see? So we've learned that ancient Mesopotamian texts describe beings called the Anunnaki, who possessed advanced knowledge. We've seen how Zecharia Sitchin interpreted these texts as evidence of extraterrestrial contact. We know academic scholars dismiss his translations, while confirming that, yes, these ancient accounts definitely predate the Bible. But here's what we haven't addressed yet. Religious authorities have known about these connections for over a century. They've had access to translations, archaeological findings, textual analyses. They've understood the implications. So what did they do with that information? How did they respond when evidence emerged that Genesis borrowed from older pagan myths? The answer is locked behind Vatican walls. And those walls have a history of keeping very important secrets. Let's start with what we actually know about the Vatican archives. The official collection contains roughly 85 kilometers of shelving, That's 53 miles. Over 35,000 volumes of cataloged materials. Hundreds of thousands of uncatalogued documents. Letters, papal bulls, state papers, financial records, diplomatic correspondence, legal proceedings, and yes, records of what the Church knew and when they knew it. Not everything is restricted. Scholars can apply for access to materials older than 75 years. But there's a catch. You need to know what you're looking for. The catalog system is complex.
Many documents aren't digitized. You can't browse randomly. You request specific items based on their archival codes, which means if you don't already know a document exists, you probably won't find it. More importantly, certain categories require special permissions. Documents related to sensitive theological controversies, papers involving modern diplomatic relations, files on internal church investigations. Access to these materials isn't automatic, even for approved scholars. You need additional clearance. You need to justify why you should be allowed to see them. And some documents, some are simply off-limits, period. Now the Church will tell you this is about privacy, protecting personal information, respecting diplomatic relationships, maintaining appropriate time gaps before sensitive materials become public. All perfectly reasonable explanations. Except when you look at the history of what the Church has hidden before, those explanations start to feel less innocent. Take Galileo. Everyone knows the story, right? The Church put him on trial for saying Earth revolves around the sun, forced him to recant, kept him under house arrest until he died. Standard religious suppression of scientific truth. But here's what most people don't know. The Church had astronomers, sophisticated ones. The Vatican Observatory was founded in 1582. Jesuit scientists were making detailed observations, calculating planetary orbits, studying the cosmos. They knew Galileo was right. They had the same data. They'd reached the same conclusions. So why condemn him? Because his findings threatened theological authority. If Earth wasn't the center of creation, if Scripture's cosmology was wrong, then what else might be wrong? The Church couldn't afford to admit that their interpretation of divine truth had been mistaken. Institutional authority mattered more than factual accuracy. And here's the kicker. The Vatican didn't officially admit Galileo was right until 1992.
359 years later. Think about that. They held on to a position they knew was false for 3.5 centuries, rather than acknowledge they'd been wrong. What else are they still holding on to? Then there's the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, started in 1559, abolished in 1966. For 407 years, the Catholic Church maintained an official list of books that Catholics were forbidden to read. The penalty for reading banned material? Excommunication. Eternal damnation. What made the list? Books that challenged church teaching, scientific works that contradicted biblical accounts, historical analyses that questioned traditional narratives, philosophical texts that promoted free thinking. Over 4,000 titles banned. Galileo made the list, obviously, but so did Descartes, Voltaire, John Stuart Mill, Victor Hugo, even Immanuel Kant. The Church controlled knowledge, not through burning every copy, though they did that too in earlier centuries, but through official prohibition backed by spiritual consequences. If you believed in the Church's authority, you wouldn't dare read forbidden material. And if you didn't believe, well, you were already outside the community of the faithful. This is how institutional information control actually works. Not through dramatic conspiracies, not through secret cabals burning evidence in the dead of night, but through systems. Through rules about what can be published, who can access archives, which interpretations are acceptable, and which questions you're not supposed to ask. Now let's talk about archaeology, because here's where things get really interesting. The Catholic Church has funded archaeological excavations for over a century. The Pontifical Biblical Institute, the École Biblique in Jerusalem, Catholic universities running digs across the Middle East. They've invested enormous resources in uncovering the ancient past. Why? Officially, to better understand the historical context of Scripture. To verify biblical accounts through physical evidence. To strengthen faith through factual confirmation. But there's another reason. Control. If you fund the excavations, you influence how findings are interpreted. If Catholic scholars do the translating, they shape what those translations say. If your institutions publish the results, you manage the narrative. This isn't speculation, it's documented pattern. When discoveries challenged biblical chronology, Catholic archaeologists emphasized ambiguities. When artifacts suggested Genesis borrowed from earlier myths, interpretations focused on how this shows universal human truth rather than plagiarism. When evidence contradicted church teaching, publications stressed the need for careful, measured analysis rather than hasty conclusions. And remember, many of the scholars doing this work were sincere. They believed in their faith. They weren't actively suppressing truth. They were interpreting evidence through the lens of their theological commitments, which is exactly how institutional control operates. You don't need a conspiracy when everyone in the system genuinely believes the institution's worldview is correct. But here's what we know happened in the 19th century. When those Mesopotamian tablets were discovered, when translations revealed creation and flood stories predating Genesis, Vatican scholars had access. The Pontifical Biblical Institute had copies. Catholic linguists studied the texts. Internal discussions happened about what these findings meant for biblical inerrancy. What conclusions did they reach? What concerns were raised? What recommendations were made about how to handle this information publicly? Those conversations are in the archives, and most researchers can't access them. Consider the timing. The Enuma Elish was translated in the 1870s. The Epic of Gilgamesh around the same time. By the 1880s, the scholarly community knew Genesis had Mesopotamian sources. Catholic institutions were deeply involved in these discoveries. Yet for the next several decades, official church teaching continued to present Genesis as original divine revelation. No acknowledgement of the parallels, no public discussion of the implications. Selective silence is a form of information control. You don't have to lie if you simply don't mention inconvenient truths. Then there's the whole question of Renaissance scholarship. Because here's something fascinating. During the Renaissance, scholars working in Vatican circles had access to classical texts that revealed extensive connections between Christianity and earlier pagan traditions. They studied Greek philosophy that predated Jesus. They translated Egyptian myths that paralleled biblical stories. They analyzed Babylonian astronomy that informed Hebrew cosmology. Some of these scholars documented their findings, wrote treatises, circulated manuscripts among educated elites. But this information didn't reach wider populations. It stayed within academic and ecclesiastical circles. The Church maintained public narratives about Christian uniqueness,
while privately acknowledging historical connections to earlier traditions. Why the separation? Because public knowledge threatens institutional power. If ordinary believers understood that biblical stories were adaptations of older myths, they might question whether divine revelation was unique or just another cultural evolution. That question undermines the entire basis of church authority. So knowledge gets managed, controlled, released carefully, or not at all. Now, fast forward to modern times. The church has gotten more sophisticated. They don't burn books anymore. They don't maintain forbidden lists. Instead, they've embraced science. The Vatican has one of the world's oldest astronomical observatories. They employ professional astronomers who publish in peer-reviewed journals. They've made statements accepting evolution, acknowledging the Big Bang, even entertaining the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Looks progressive, right? Looks like openness to evidence regardless of theological implications. But look closer. The Church accepts evolution as a biological mechanism while maintaining that God guided the process. They acknowledge the Big Bang as physical fact while asserting it reveals the moment of divine creation. They entertain alien life while preserving humanity's special relationship with God. Every scientific acceptance comes with theological hedges. Every admission of physical reality gets reinterpreted through spiritual frameworks. The strategy has evolved from suppression to incorporation. Don't fight science. Absorb it. Recontextualize it. Control the narrative by controlling the interpretation. This matters for understanding how the Church handles evidence about human origins. If ancient texts describe the Anunnaki as advanced beings who shaped civilization, the Church has three options. Deny the texts exist, dismiss them as mythology, or reinterpret them as garbled memories of angels or demons within Christian cosmology. Guess which option they chose? The third. Ancient gods become fallen angels. The Anunnaki become demons deceiving humanity. Mesopotamian myths become corrupted versions of true revelation preserved only in Scripture. This interpretive framework allows acknowledgement of the evidence while neutralizing its implications. Yes, ancient texts describe powerful beings. Yes, they predate the Bible. But properly understood, they confirm rather than challenge Christian teaching. Problem solved. Orthodoxy preserved. Except, here's what bothers me about this. The 75-year rule. Documents don't become available until 75 years after their creation, which means anything from 1949 or later is still restricted.
What discussions happened in church circles after World War II about ancient texts and human origins? What correspondence exists about how to handle archaeological findings? What internal debates occurred about biblical inerrancy versus historical evidence? We don't know. We can't access those records yet. They're still secret. Still restricted, still locked behind permissions that most scholars will never receive. And certain categories of documents require special permissions, even when they're older than 75 years. Biblical archaeology, comparative mythology, theological controversies. Access to these materials isn't guaranteed even for approved researchers with legitimate academic credentials. Why? What are they protecting? What's so sensitive that even after decades, it requires extra gatekeeping? The official answer is that these are complex theological matters requiring specialized expertise to interpret properly.
can't have amateurs misunderstanding nuanced arguments, can't risk sensationalist misrepresentations, need to ensure scholarly rigor. All true, but also convenient. Because the same restrictions that prevent misinterpretation also prevent verification. We can't check what the Church knew and when without accessing the archives. We can't confirm whether they suppressed information without seeing documents that might reveal suppression. It's a perfect circular defense. We're not hiding anything, they say. You just need permission to look. But permission is rarely granted, and even when it is, you need to know what to request, and the catalog doesn't reveal everything that exists. Consider what happened with Inquisition records. For centuries, these were completely sealed. Then, in 1998, the Church opened portions of the archive. Scholars discovered evidence of torture, forced confessions, executions for heresy that Church histories had downplayed or denied, documentation of systematic persecution that official narratives had sanitized.
The records existed all along. The Church knew what they contained. But until external pressure forced disclosure, that information remained locked away, hidden in plain sight behind Vatican walls. What else is still locked away? What other documents exist that would revise our understanding of what the Church knew about human origins, ancient texts, and the connections between Genesis and Mesopotamian mythology? We know they had access to the tablets. We know Catholic scholars studied the translations. We know internal discussions happened. But we don't know what conclusions they reached, or what decisions they made about managing that information. And that uncertainty, that gap between what we can confirm and what remains hidden, creates space for reasonable suspicion. Not conspiracy theory, not paranoid speculation, but legitimate questions about whether institutions with theological investments in particular narratives can be trusted to fully disclose evidence that challenges those narratives. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The Church has a documented history of suppressing information, of maintaining positions they knew were false, of controlling knowledge through restrictions, prohibitions, and selective disclosure. This isn't speculation. It's historical fact. So when they restrict access to documents about biblical archaeology and comparative mythology, when they require special permissions for research that might reveal uncomfortable parallels, when they maintain that 75-year seal on modern correspondence, we have every reason to ask, what are you protecting? Institutional authority? Theological coherence? The belief that Scripture is divinely unique rather than culturally adapted? Or something more? Something about what ancient texts actually describe? Something about beings called the Anunnaki, whose very existence threatens the foundation of religious orthodoxy. Because if the Vatican has nothing to hide regarding humanity's ancient origins, if archaeological evidence supports rather than challenges biblical narratives, if Mesopotamian texts are just primitive mythology with no deeper significance, then why the restrictions? Why the special permissions? Why the continued control over who can see what and when? What are they protecting? And what would happen if we could finally read those sealed documents about what Church scholars really thought when they first studied the Anunnaki texts? Maybe it's time we stopped accepting institutional assurances and started demanding answers. Not from Zecharia Sitchin's controversial interpretations, not from alternative researchers with speculative theories, but from the ancient texts themselves. What do the Sumerian tablets actually say about the Anunnaki? What did ancient scribes record about these beings? What knowledge,
What descriptions? What details exist in the original sources? Before centuries of translation, interpretation, and institutional management shaped what we're allowed to believe. The answers are written in cuneiform, carved in clay, preserved for millennia. And finally, we're going to read what they actually say. The Sumerians didn't write myths. They kept records, tax receipts, grain inventories, star charts, legal contracts. When they carved wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, they weren't creating religious fantasies. They were documenting reality as they understood it. So when those same tablets describe beings called the Anunnaki, we need to ask a very uncomfortable question. Were they recording gods? Or were they naming their rulers? We've seen how the Vatican restricts access to documents about ancient texts and human origins. We know they're protecting something. But protecting what? To answer that, we need to go straight to the source. Not Sitchin's interpretations, not Vatican reinterpretations. The actual Sumerian tablets.
What do they really say about the Anunnaki?
Here's where things get fascinating, because the tablets don't speak with one voice. They span over 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. Languages evolved, meanings shifted, and the term Anunnaki itself underwent dramatic transformations that reveal something scholars still debate today. Let's start with the word itself, Anunnaki. In the oldest Sumerian texts, it appears as Anun-na. The scholarly consensus, documented by researchers like A. Falkenstein in his foundational study, translates this as something like princely offspring or offspring of royal seed. The Nun symbol typically means prince or ruler. The A prefix suggests lineage or descent. So far, pretty straightforward. Divine beings of noble lineage, gods born from gods, nothing controversial. But here's where it gets interesting. The term evolved. Later Akkadian texts use Anunnaku or Anunnaki, and suddenly there's debate. Does the key suffix mean of the earth? Does it mean from heaven? Sitchin famously argued it meant those who from heaven to earth came. Academic linguists say that's grammatically impossible in Sumerian. The construction doesn't work that way. Except, and this is important, the texts consistently describe these beings as connected to the heavens, as descending from the sky, as dwelling in celestial realms before arriving on earth. The grammar might not support Sitchin's exact translation, but the narrative content absolutely describes beings who came from above. So which is it? Are we dealing with earth deities who happen to live in heavenly realms, as mainstream scholars suggest? Or beings who literally descended from the sky, as alternative researchers argue? The linguistic evidence allows both readings depending on your assumptions about what's possible. Let's look at the actual texts. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic we discussed earlier, features the Anunnaki prominently. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos, the Anunnaki gather in council. They're described as mighty beings, judges, decision-makers. They determine the fates of humanity. But here's the detail most people miss. The text specifies numbers. In some versions, there are 300 Anunnaki in heaven and 300 on earth. 600 total. Why such specific quantities? Mythological gods don't usually come in precisely numbered batches. You don't find texts saying, "and the 73 Olympian gods decreed," or "the 217 Norse deities assembled." But Sumerian texts repeatedly give exact numbers for the Anunnaki. Administrative precision in religious texts. That's unusual. Then there's the Atrahasis, another flood narrative older than the one in Gilgamesh. In this version, the Anunnaki create humans for a very specific reason. They're tired of doing the work themselves. The text describes the Anunnaki digging canals, dredging rivers, excavating foundations, backbreaking labor.
After 40 years, they rebel. They burn their tools. They march on the house of Enlil, the chief administrator. Think about that language. Not the chief god, the chief administrator. Like a project manager, a supervisor overseeing operations. The text then describes a solution. The goddess Nintu, sometimes called Ninhursag, is instructed to create a worker species. She takes clay and mixes it with the blood of a slain god. From this mixture, humanity is fashioned. 7 males, 7 females, the first batch. Now scholars will tell you this is purely symbolic. Clay represents earth, blood represents life force. The mixing represents the merging of divine and earthly realms in human nature. All metaphorical, all theological. But read the text closely. It describes a deliberate process, specific materials, intentional design, a prototype. The language resembles a recipe or a procedure, more than a mystical incantation.
The goddess even declares that the new beings will bear the toil that the gods have been bearing. They're purpose-built laborers. Is this mythology? Or is this a pre-scientific culture's attempt to describe genetic engineering using the only vocabulary available to them? Here's where the discussion gets really uncomfortable for academics, because Sumerian texts contain astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist. They describe planetary orbits accurately. They track celestial mechanics. They understand precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle and requires extremely long-term observation to detect. The Sumerians charted these cycles. They knew about planets not visible to the naked eye. Their star catalogs match what modern astronomy confirms. But how? They didn't have telescopes. They didn't have the mathematical tools to calculate orbits based on limited observations. Yet their records are accurate. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to careful observation over many generations, combined with mathematical inference. Ancient people were smarter than we give them credit for. They could extrapolate from what they saw. Maybe. But that doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why Sumerian texts describe the solar system from an external perspective. Multiple tablets show astronomical diagrams as if viewed from outside Earth's orbit, as if someone was looking at the solar system from a distance, rather than from Earth's surface looking up. One tablet, known as Cylinder Seal VA243, depicts what appears to be a solar system with 11 celestial bodies around a central star. Sitchin argued this showed knowledge of all the planets, including one we haven't discovered. Skeptics say it's just decorative symbols with no astronomical meaning. But here's what both sides agree on. Sumerian astronomical knowledge was extraordinarily advanced for their supposed level of technology. Whether they gained it through patient observation or from external teachers, they knew things they shouldn't have known. Let's talk about the Anunnaki's physical descriptions. In art and cylinder seals, they're portrayed as humanoid, but distinctly taller than regular humans. They wear elaborate headdresses, sometimes described as crowns with horns. They carry objects that mainstream archaeology calls ceremonial wands, or symbols of authority. But look at the details. Some of these objects have multiple parts, connectors, what appear to be grips or handles, positioned for functionality rather than symbolism. In several depictions, Anunnaki figures wear what look like wristwatches, circular objects on their forearms with visible faces. Now, conventional interpretation says these are bracelets, decorative jewelry signifying status. But the consistency is striking. Multiple tablets, multiple time periods, always the same positioning, always the same general shape. If they're just bracelets,
Why are they depicted so uniformly and prominently? Then there's the pinecone symbol, held by Anunnaki figures in numerous carvings. Mainstream scholars call it a symbol of fertility or regeneration. But some alternative researchers point out its resemblance to the pineal gland, which modern biology recognizes as involved in regulating consciousness and circadian rhythms. Could ancient sculptors have known about internal brain structures? Unlikely, but the symbolism is curious. The texts also describe Anunnaki possessing MEs. Scholars translate ME as divine powers or divine decrees. But here's the interesting part. MEs are portable. They can be stolen, transferred, worn as jewelry. In the myth, Inanna and the god of wisdom, the goddess Inanna gets Enki drunk and steals his MEs, then flees with them to her city. If MEs are abstract divine powers, how do you get someone drunk and physically steal them? But if MEs are objects, devices, perhaps data storage or access codes,
suddenly the narrative makes practical sense. You could wear them. You could steal them. You could transfer them from one being to another. The Sumerian word, me, is never fully explained in the texts. It's treated as something everyone at the time understood, which means we're translating based on context and assumption. And our assumptions about what's possible shape what we think the word means. Let's examine the hierarchy. Sumerian texts are very clear about Anunnaki organizational structure. Anu is the father figure, dwelling in heaven. Enlil is the chief administrator on earth, managing operations. Enki is the scientist or engineer, solving technical problems. Under them are dozens of other named Anunnaki, each with specific functions. Ninhursag handles genetic creation. Ningishzida deals with healing and life sciences. Ninurta leads military operations. This isn't how mythological pantheons typically work. Greek gods overlap in domains. Norse gods have fluid responsibilities. Egyptian deities merge and separate across different periods. But the Anunnaki read like an organizational chart, like a management structure. Everyone has a defined role, clear reporting lines, specific jurisdictions. The Sumerian king list adds another strange detail. It divides history into two periods, before the flood and after. Before the flood, kings reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns become more realistic. A few decades, a century at most. Scholars dismiss the pre-flood numbers as mythological exaggeration, but the text treats them as factual record-keeping. It uses the same format, the same language, the same documentary style for both periods. If the post-flood section is historical record, why assume the pre-flood section is mythology? Unless the pre-flood section is also recording something real. Something involving beings who lived far longer than humans.
Beings who might have possessed technologies for life extension that seemed impossible to ancient scribes trying to document what they'd been told. Now here's where linguistic ambiguity becomes crucial. When Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki using words like shining, radiant, terrifying, how do we translate that? Mainstream scholars default to divine attributes. Of course, gods shine. Of course, they radiate power. Of course, mortals find them terrifying, all standard religious imagery. But what if a Sumerian scribe was trying to describe technology? What words would they use? They don't have vocabulary for engines, propulsion,
energy fields, protective barriers. So they use available language, things that shine, things that radiate, things that inspire terror through sheer power. A German researcher named Wolfram von Soden studied how these terms evolved across centuries of Mesopotamian texts. He documented how meanings shifted, how theological concepts absorbed older traditions, how later scribes reinterpreted earlier records through new cultural frameworks. His work shows that what we call consistent mythology is actually a constantly evolving attempt to make sense of inherited traditions that later generations didn't fully understand. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature contains thousands of texts where you can verify these patterns yourself. Read the primary sources. See how the same terms get used in different contexts. Notice the inconsistencies, the puzzles, the moments where translations don't quite capture what the original seems to be describing. And pay attention to what the texts emphasize. They don't just say, the Anunnaki taught humanity. They specify what was taught. Agriculture. Not just farming, but irrigation engineering, crop rotation, seed selection. Mathematics. Not just counting, but geometry, astronomy-based calculation, architectural planning. Metallurgy. Not just using metal, but mining, smelting, alloy creation. Writing itself is described as a gift from the Anunnaki, the technology that allows knowledge to be preserved across generations. These aren't vague divine blessings. These are specific knowledge transfers. Technical instruction. The texts read less like religious origin myths and more like acknowledgement of an educational program. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. If this is all just mythology, if ancient Sumerians were simply projecting human social structures onto imaginary gods, why do the texts contain accurate astronomical data? Why do they describe celestial mechanics that wouldn't be confirmed until millennia later? Why do they include mathematical constants, architectural principles, metallurgical techniques that work? You can't accidentally mythology your way into calculating the precession of the equinoxes. You can't accidentally create functional bronze alloy ratios through religious imagination. Either the Sumerians figured this out through their own sophisticated observation and experimentation, which would make them far more scientifically advanced than we give them credit for, or they got the information from somewhere else. Both possibilities are remarkable. One suggests ancient humans were capable of scientific thinking we normally attribute to much later periods. The other suggests external knowledge transfer. Either way, something significant happened in ancient Mesopotamia that our standard historical models don't adequately explain. And the texts are clear about one thing. They consistently attribute this knowledge to the Anunnaki. Over and over, across centuries of records, the same claim. The Anunnaki taught us. The Anunnaki showed us. The Anunnaki gave us the tools to build civilization. So we're left with a fundamental choice. Either we dismiss thousands of years of consistent testimony as primitive superstition, or we take seriously the possibility that ancient scribes were recording something real.
Not necessarily alien visitation, not necessarily Sitchin's interpretation, but something that involved the transfer of sophisticated knowledge from beings the Sumerians considered separate from and superior to ordinary humanity. The texts exist. The knowledge exists. The astronomical accuracy exists. The mathematical precision exists. The organizational specificity exists. The technological descriptions exist.
all documented, all verifiable, all waiting in tablets you can examine yourself if you learn to read cuneiform. What the texts are actually describing, gods, teachers, rulers, or something we don't have a category for yet, that's where interpretation begins. And that's where institutions start protecting their preferred narratives. Because if the Sumerians were recording actual history, if the Anunnaki were real in some sense we don't fully understand, then everything changes. The biblical creation story becomes secondary literature. Religious institutions lose their claim to original revelation. Human origins involve factors we haven't seriously considered. No wonder some documents remain restricted. No wonder translations emphasize safe mythological readings. No wonder alternative interpretations get dismissed as pseudoscience before they're seriously examined. The texts are clear about one thing. The Anunnaki possessed knowledge far beyond what Sumerian civilization should have had access to. Astronomical understanding that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. Mathematical precision requiring tools they supposedly didn't have. Engineering capabilities we still find impressive today. How did ancient scribes accurately describe celestial mechanics they couldn't observe? How did they record technical processes they couldn't understand? Were they inventing elaborate fantasies that coincidentally contained accurate scientific information? Or were they preserving something given to them? Something taught?
Something passed down with instructions to remember, to record, to transmit to future generations, even if the meaning was lost. The tablets hold the answer, written in their own words, waiting for us to read, without the filters of institutional interpretation, without the assumptions that close off possibilities before we've honestly examined the evidence. And when we do that, when we look at what the texts actually say about creation, about the fashioning of humanity, about the specific details of how the Anunnaki supposedly brought us into existence, we find descriptions that sound disturbingly similar to something we only recently learned how to do ourselves. Genetic engineering, purpose-built organisms, deliberate design. The Sumerians called it mixing clay with divine blood. What would we call it today? What if the Garden of Eden wasn't a paradise? What if it was a laboratory? What if Adam and Eve weren't the first humans, but the first successful experiment? And what if the forbidden fruit represented not sin, but the moment humans became conscious, self-aware beings, capable of independent thought? These aren't new questions. They've been whispered in alternative research circles for decades. But here's what's changed. Modern genetic science is making them impossible to ignore. We've seen how Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki with impossible knowledge. Astronomical data they couldn't have observed. Mathematical precision they shouldn't have possessed. But now we need to address the biggest question of all. What do these texts say about us? About human origins? About how we became what we are? Because when you compare ancient creation myths with modern genetics, something disturbing emerges. The stories match. Not in the details, but in the pattern. And that pattern suggests something happened to humanity that we don't fully understand yet. Let's start with the creation accounts themselves. We've already seen how Genesis borrowed from Mesopotamian sources. But look closer at what those sources actually describe. The Atrahasis doesn't just say humans were created. It describes a process, a deliberate procedure with specific steps. First, the goddess Nintu is instructed to create workers. She's not praying. She's not performing magic. She's following instructions. Mix clay with the blood of a slain god. Prepare the mixture. Fashion it into forms. 7 males, 7 females. The first batch. That language. Batch. Like a manufacturing run. Like a prototype series. The text even describes earlier attempts that failed. Models that didn't work out. Designs that had to be abandoned and revised. Multiple iterations before achieving a successful result. Now, mainstream scholars will tell you this is purely mythological. The clay represents Earth. The blood represents divine life force. The mixing symbolizes humanity's dual nature, both earthly and divine. All metaphor, all theology. But hold on. Because when James Watson and Francis Crick described DNA in 1953, they revolutionized how we understand life. Suddenly we had a mechanism, genetic code, information encoded in molecules. Life wasn't mystical anymore. It was chemistry, biology, instructions written in 4 letters. A, T, G, C. And here's what makes the ancient texts so unsettling. They describe exactly that kind of process, using pre-scientific language. Take biological material from one source, combine it with material from another source, follow a specific procedure, create a new organism with desired traits. If you were an ancient Sumerian scribe trying to describe genetic engineering, what words would you use? You don't have vocabulary for DNA, chromosomes, gene splicing, so you use available metaphors. Clay that can be molded, blood that carries life essence, mixing that combines properties, divine breath that animates the result. The process described in Atrahasis maps perfectly onto what we now know genetic engineering actually involves. Take genetic material, combine it with different genetic material, create something new that exhibits traits from both sources. Coincidence? Maybe. But then you notice something else. The texts describe multiple attempts, failed prototypes, models that didn't survive or couldn't reproduce properly. This matches what modern genetic engineering encounters. You don't get successful results on the first try. You iterate, you test, you refine. Evolutionary biology shows the same pattern, actually. Human evolution isn't a straight line. It's a bush with many branches. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, multiple hominid species, most of which went extinct. Only one line survived to become us. Natural selection? Or something more directed? Here's where genetics gets really interesting. In 2005, researchers discovered something strange about human chromosome 2. It's actually 2 chromosomes that fused together. Every other great ape has 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23, because 2 of them merged. This fusion is unique to humans. It happened after we split from our common ancestor with chimpanzees, and it's one of the key genetic differences that makes us distinctly human. The question is why? Random mutation? Or deliberate editing?
We can't know for certain, but the fusion is there, documented, verified. Something changed in our chromosomes that didn't change in any other primate lineage. Then there's the timeline problem. Anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record around 200,000 years ago. For 150,000 years, they behave basically like other hominids. Stone tools, hunting, gathering, nothing special. Then, roughly 50,000 years ago, everything changes. Suddenly there's symbolic thinking, art, complex language, ritual burial, music, innovation, technology rapidly advancing.
This is called the Great Leap Forward, and anthropology has no consensus explanation for it. What happened? What triggered this sudden explosion of consciousness and creativity? Did our brains physically change? Did a genetic mutation spread through the population? Did we reach some critical threshold of neural complexity that enabled new cognitive abilities? Or, as researcher Igor Berner suggests in his analysis of ancient texts and modern genetics, did something activate capabilities that were already encoded in our DNA? Like flipping a switch, like unlocking dormant potential. The Genesis story captures this moment perfectly. Adam and Eve exist in the garden, innocent, unaware. Then they eat from the tree of knowledge. Suddenly their eyes are opened. They become conscious. They feel shame. They recognize choice. They become fully human in a way they weren't before. Traditional theology reads this as sin, the fall from grace, disobedience that cursed humanity. But what if it's describing something else? The moment of awakening, when proto-humans became consciously aware beings, when we stopped being animals and became something more. Neuroscience has identified specific brain structures associated with self-awareness and consciousness. The prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula. These regions enable abstract thought, future planning, moral reasoning. They make us human, and they require specific genetic configurations to develop properly. Small changes in regulatory genes can dramatically alter brain development. A mutation in the FOXP2 gene affects language capability. Changes in the HAR1 gene influence cortical neuron production. Modifications in the ASPM gene impact brain size. These genetic tweaks separate us from our closest relatives. When did these changes occur? The fossil record can't tell us. Soft tissue doesn't preserve. But genetic analysis suggests many of these human-specific mutations emerged relatively recently.
Within the last 200,000 years. Around the same time, anatomically modern humans appear. And behavioral modernity explodes around 50,000 years ago. The timing is suspicious. Something happened. Something changed us genetically and cognitively in a remarkably short evolutionary time frame. Now, let's talk about gold, because this is where the ancient texts get really specific about motivation. The Atrahasis describes the Anunnaki digging for resources. Other texts explicitly mention gold mining operations. Sitchin argued this was the primary reason for their presence on Earth. They needed gold to repair their planet's atmosphere. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as absurd. Why would an advanced civilization need to physically mine gold from another planet? If they can travel between stars, surely they can synthesize elements or extract resources more efficiently. But here's where modern science gets interesting. Gold has unique properties. It's highly conductive. It doesn't corrode. It reflects radiation. It's chemically stable. These properties make it invaluable for advanced technology. NASA uses gold foil for thermal protection on spacecraft. Electronics rely on gold connections for reliable conductivity. Research published in Nature Communications has shown how gold nanoparticles can stabilize molecular structures in ways no other element can replicate. In nanotechnology applications,
Gold enables precision that's impossible with alternative materials. So the idea that an advanced civilization might value gold for technological purposes, that's not crazy. That's scientifically plausible. Whether they'd need to mine it from Earth specifically is debatable. But the fundamental premise that gold has practical technological value beyond ornamentation, completely valid. And here's what makes the ancient texts intriguing. They don't describe gold as valuable for beauty or status. They describe it as necessary, required,
critical for some specific purpose that texts don't fully explain. It's treated as a functional resource, not a decorative luxury. The texts also describe humans being created specifically to mine and extract resources. We were workforce, labor, purpose-built for specific tasks. After the Anunnaki rebels refused to continue the backbreaking work, humans were engineered to take over those responsibilities. Is this history or metaphor? Is it describing actual resource extraction operations? Or is it allegorizing social hierarchies and class structures? Look at human history. Early civilizations emerged around mining regions. Gold, copper, tin, bronze. Societies organized around resource extraction and metallurgy. Labor forces employed in dangerous, difficult mining operations. Is this independent cultural development? Or is it an echo of something older? A pattern established in humanity's earliest days? We can't know, but the consistency is notable. Across cultures, across continents, mining and metallurgy appear at the foundation of civilization, as if we were taught, as if we were designed for this. Then there's the genetic bottleneck evidence. Mitochondrial DNA analysis suggests all living humans descend from a single female ancestor, approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. She's called mitochondrial Eve, not because she was the only woman alive, but because all other maternal lineages went extinct. Only her line survived. Y chromosome analysis shows a similar pattern for males. Y chromosome Adam lived roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Again, not the only male, but the only male whose lineage persists in modern populations. These bottlenecks indicate human population underwent severe reduction multiple times. Genetic diversity collapsed. Only small groups survived. Then, populations expanded again from these limited gene pools. Mainstream science explains this through climate events, resource scarcity, natural disasters that devastated populations.
Survivors repopulated. Evolution proceeded from these founding populations. But alternative researchers point out another interpretation. Bottlenecks also result from selective breeding, from intentional population management, from creating new varieties using limited founding stock, which is exactly what genetic engineering requires. You start with a small group, test viability, expand successful lines. Could both explanations be true? Could natural bottlenecks have been exploited for artificial selection? Could disasters have provided opportunities for genetic intervention disguised as population recovery? We are asking uncomfortable questions here. Questions that blur the line between natural evolution and directed development, between random mutation and intelligent design, between accident and intention. And that's where the serpent becomes relevant. Because across cultures, serpents symbolize knowledge, transformation, and consciousness. In Eden,
the serpent offers the fruit of knowledge. In Egypt, the Uraeus serpent represents divine wisdom. In Kundalini traditions, the serpent represents awakening energy rising through consciousness levels. In Mesopotamian imagery, serpents accompany gods who bring civilization. Why serpents specifically? Some researchers suggest it's because serpent imagery represents DNA, the double helix, the twisted ladder structure that encodes life. Ancient peoples couldn't have known about DNA's structure. But what if they were taught symbolic representations of genetic concepts, using images they could understand? Serpents shed their skin, representing transformation. Serpents' sinuous form resembles twisted strands. Serpents in myths bring knowledge and change. Is this universal archetype, or specific teaching preserved across cultures? The Eden story becomes even more interesting when you realize the serpent isn't the villain. It tells the truth. God said eating the fruit would bring death. The serpent said it would bring knowledge and make them like gods. Who was right? Adam and Eve didn't die. They gained awareness. They became conscious. The serpent's promise was accurate. So, what is the serpent in this story? The voice of rebellion? The agent of enlightenment? Or perhaps something else entirely? Perhaps the genetic factor that activated consciousness? The final piece that made us fully human? The modification that the creators didn't intend, but that happened anyway? The text says, God was worried after humans ate the fruit. Worried they might also eat from the tree of life and live forever. That's a strange fear for an omnipotent deity, but it makes perfect sense if the story is describing containment failure. The subjects gained unintended capabilities. Now, they need to be prevented from accessing further enhancements. Modern genetic engineering encounters this same problem. Genetically modified organisms sometimes develop unexpected traits. Genes interact in unpredictable ways. You design for one outcome and get unintended consequences. Then, you have to manage those consequences, limit further modifications, prevent uncontrolled enhancement. The Genesis narrative reads less like religious allegory and more like a project report on containment protocols after experimental subjects exceeded parameters. And that brings us to the really uncomfortable question. Because today, right now, we do genetic engineering routinely. CRISPR allows precise DNA editing. We've created disease-resistant crops. We've engineered bacteria to produce insulin. Chinese scientists shocked the world in 2018 by creating gene-edited babies. What seemed impossible in 1976, when Sitchin published his theories, is now high school biology lab technology. We design organisms with specific traits. We modify genes to achieve desired outcomes. We create life that couldn't exist through natural processes alone. If we can do it now with primitive 21st century technology, what could a civilization thousands or millions of years more advanced accomplish? Could they design a species from scratch? Could they take existing hominids and upgrade their capabilities? Could they create workers purpose-built for specific tasks? The answer is obviously yes. If we can do it, they could do it better.
The question isn't capability. The question is whether they did. And here's where we return to the central tension. Science confirms something dramatic happened to human genetics. Multiple bottlenecks, chromosome fusion, rapid emergence of cognitive capabilities, an explosion of consciousness and culture with no clear evolutionary explanation. Ancient texts describe beings who deliberately fashioned humans, mixed divine essence with earthly material, created us through a process involving specific procedures and multiple attempts, designed us for particular purposes. These are two different explanations for the same timeline, the same evidence, the same genetic signatures that science can measure but struggles to fully explain. Mainstream science says natural evolution with some unusual but explicable events. Alternative researchers say directed genetic engineering by advanced beings. Both are interpreting the same data. Both are building narratives to explain evidence that exists, regardless of interpretation. So, which is correct? Are we describing the mechanism or the agents? Is science mapping the biology while ancient texts preserved the who and why? Or is there no connection at all? Are we seeing patterns that don't exist? Reading modern knowledge back into ancient texts that means something completely different? Here's what we know for certain. Human genetics changed rapidly in recent evolutionary time. Our cognitive capabilities emerged suddenly. Ancient texts describe this emergence as deliberate creation by advanced beings. Modern genetic engineering makes such creation theoretically possible. The texts exist. The genetics exist.
The timeline exists. The question is what connection, if any, exists between them. But here's what should really make you think. This pattern isn't unique to Mesopotamia. The same story appears everywhere. Different cultures, different continents, separated by oceans and millennia, all describing the same thing. Beings from the sky who created humans, taught civilization, and shaped our destiny. If it's mythology, why is it global? If it's independent invention, why are the details so consistent? If it's cultural memory, what exactly are we remembering? Because once you start looking, you find it everywhere. Egypt, India, China, Mesoamerica, Polynesia. Every ancient culture preserves stories about sky people who brought knowledge. And they don't describe it as mythology. They describe it as history. What are the odds that every civilization on Earth independently invented the same false story about the same non-existent beings doing the same imaginary things? Science confirms. Something changed us. Ancient texts describe who changed us and why. Are these two different explanations for the same event? Or is mainstream science simply describing the mechanism, while ancient texts preserved the agents? The answer might be written in our DNA, encoded in genetic sequences we're only beginning to understand, waiting for us to develop the technology and courage to read what's really there. And it might be written in other ancient texts, on other continents, in other languages, all telling the same story, all pointing to the same conclusion, that humanity's origin is far stranger than we've been told, and far more global than Mesopotamian texts alone reveal. From the pyramids of Egypt to the temples of Central America, from the megalithic structures of Easter Island to the astronomical observatories of ancient India, separated by oceans and millennia, ancient civilizations built impossible monuments
and encoded sophisticated knowledge they shouldn't have possessed.
Were they all independently brilliant?
Or did they share teachers? So we've established that something changed human genetics and consciousness. We've seen how ancient Mesopotamian texts describe deliberate creation by advanced beings. But here's the question that should make everyone uncomfortable. If this story appears only in Sumerian tablets, maybe it's just regional mythology, cultural imagination, local tradition. But it doesn't appear only in Mesopotamia. It appears everywhere. Different languages, different continents, different time periods, all describing the same thing. Beings from the sky who brought knowledge, taught civilization, and shaped humanity's destiny. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns demand explanation. Let's start with the myths themselves, because once you start looking, you can't unsee it. Every ancient culture preserves stories about sky gods who descended to teach humanity fundamental skills. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, the things that separate civilization from hunter-gatherer existence. In Sumer, it's the Anunnaki. In Egypt, it's the Neteru who came from the stars. In India, the Vedas describe the Devas descending in flying vehicles called Vimanas. In China, the Yellow Emperor arrives from the heavens to teach silk production and writing. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha bring agriculture and astronomy. In Polynesia, the Sky People teach navigation and agriculture. Different names, different cultural contexts, but the same narrative structure. Beings from above. Knowledge transfer. Transformation of primitive humans into civilized societies. Now, mainstream anthropology explains this through convergent cultural evolution. Humans everywhere face similar challenges. We develop similar solutions. We create similar myths to explain our development. It's psychological universality, archetypal storytelling. The human brain naturally generates these patterns. Maybe.
But that doesn't explain why the details match. Not just vague similarities, specific details, technologies, capabilities, descriptions that shouldn't appear in isolated cultures with no contact. Take the Dogon people of Mali, remote West African tribe. No written language until modern times. Oral traditions passed down through priests. In the 1930s, French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen spent years studying Dogon cosmology. What they documented was impossible. The Dogon described Sirius B, a white dwarf star orbiting Sirius A, invisible to the naked eye. Western science only confirmed its existence through telescopic observation in the 1860s, and didn't photograph it until 1970. Yet the Dogon had detailed knowledge centuries earlier. They knew it orbited Sirius A every 50 years. That's correct. The actual orbital period is 50.1 years. They knew it was incredibly dense. White dwarfs are indeed among the densest objects in the universe. They drew diagrams showing its elliptical orbit. How? They said their ancestors were taught by the Nomo, amphibious beings who came from Sirius in flying vessels, who descended into water and shared knowledge before departing. Skeptics argue the Dogon must have learned this from Western visitors in the early 1900s. Cultural contamination. But Griot's detailed records show the knowledge was already integrated into their religious ceremonies, their artwork, their sacred traditions, long before telescopic data could have reached them. And here's what makes it weirder. Egyptian mythology also reveres Sirius. Their entire calendar was based on its heliacal rising. They called it Sopdet. They associated it with Isis and Osiris. Why would two African cultures, separated by thousands of miles, both focus specifically on Sirius? Both describe it as the source of teachers and knowledge. Coincidence starts feeling inadequate. Then there's the architecture, because ancient civilizations didn't just preserve similar myths. They built similar structures, using techniques we still don't fully understand. Precision stone cutting that modern tools struggle to replicate. Megalithic construction, moving blocks weighing hundreds of tons. Astronomical alignments, accurate to fractions of a degree. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built roughly 4,500 years ago. 2 million stone blocks, some weighing 80 tons, fitted so precisely you can't slide paper between them. Aligned to true north, with an error of less than 4 minutes of arc. Encodes pi in its dimensions. The ratio of perimeter to height equals 2 pi. Contains the golden ratio in its proportions. Aligns with Orion's belt with precision, suggesting advanced astronomical knowledge. We still debate how it was built. No consensus exists. Ramps would require more material than the pyramid itself. Internal ramps don't match the architecture. Lever systems don't explain the precision. The official explanation is basically lots of workers and time, which doesn't actually explain the engineering. Now look at Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun, built roughly 2,000 years ago. Massive structure aligned to calendrical and astronomical cycles, encoding mathematical ratios, using similar megalithic techniques. Or Machu Picchu, stones fitted so precisely you can't insert a blade. No mortar, just perfect joints created by techniques we can't replicate with modern tools. Or Easter Island. Moai statues weighing up to 80 tons, transported across the island and erected using methods still debated. And more impressively, the island's foundation, massive stone platforms, composed of precisely fitted megalithic blocks that predate the statues by potentially thousands of years. These civilizations had no contact. They're separated by oceans that couldn't be crossed with their supposed technology. Yet they use identical building techniques. They encode the same mathematical constants. They align structures to the same celestial events. The golden ratio, 1.618. This number appears in nature, in art, in optimal proportions. The Egyptians encoded it in the pyramids. The Greeks used it in the Parthenon. The Mayans built it into their temple ratios. All independently, all discovering the same aesthetically pleasing mathematical constant and deciding to encode it in their most important structures. Pi, 3.14159. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encoded. Stonehenge's geometry contains it. Temple complexes in Southeast Asia reflect it. These civilizations supposedly didn't have advanced mathematics. Yet somehow they all discovered and preserved the same irrational constant. Precession of the equinoxes. A 26,000-year cycle caused by Earth's axial wobble.
You can't observe this in a single lifetime. You need extremely long-term astronomical records. Yet multiple ancient cultures tracked it. The Egyptians encoded it in their architecture. The Mayans calculated it. The Vedic texts describe it. How did civilizations with lifespans measured in decades track a cycle that takes 260 centuries to complete? Unless they were taught. Unless someone with longer time perspectives showed them. Unless knowledge was transmitted rather than independently discovered. Here's where it gets even stranger. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, discovered in the 1990s, radiocarbon dated to 9,600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. 6,000 years before Stonehenge. 7,000 years before the pyramids. Built before agriculture supposedly existed, before civilization as we understand it. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with sophisticated artwork, requiring organized labor, specialized skills, social hierarchy, food surplus to support non-farming workers. All the markers of advanced civilization. 6,000 years before advanced civilization supposedly began.
This single site forces us to revise everything we thought we knew about human development. Either our timelines are wrong, or something else happened that we haven't accounted for. Some catalyst. Some teacher. Some knowledge source that jump-started civilization earlier than we believed possible. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Similar sites are being discovered worldwide, structures that predate agricultural civilization, complex societies existing before we thought complex societies could exist. The pattern keeps repeating. Sophisticated knowledge appearing suddenly, rather than evolving gradually. Then there are the artifacts that shouldn't exist. The Antikythera mechanism, ancient Greek device, recovered from a shipwreck, dated to roughly 100 BCE. When researchers finally decoded it using modern X-ray technology, they discovered something shocking. It's an analog computer, a sophisticated astronomical calculator with dozens of interlocking gears, predicting solar and lunar eclipses, tracking planetary positions, modeling celestial mechanics. Nothing comparable appears in the archaeological record for another 1,000 years. It's like finding a smartphone in a medieval castle. The technology exists in complete isolation. No evolutionary development leading to it. No similar devices found. Just this one impossibly advanced artifact, suggesting knowledge that disappeared. Or the Baghdad Battery. Clay jars from 200 BCE containing copper cylinders and iron rods. When filled with acidic liquid, they generate electric current. Ancient batteries. But according to mainstream history, electricity wasn't understood until the 1700s. Benjamin Franklin flew his kite in 1752. Yet here's evidence of electrochemical cells existing 2,000 years earlier. Mainstream archaeologists say they weren't batteries. They were storage jars. The electrical properties are coincidental. But the design is too specific. The materials too precisely chosen. An ancient text described magical stones that produced light without fire. What if those weren't metaphors? Ancient maps pose another problem. The Piri-Reis map from 1513 shows Antarctica's coastline, before Antarctica was discovered. And not just Antarctica, it shows the coastline beneath the ice. Accurately. The continent wasn't confirmed to exist until 1820. The subglacial coastline wasn't mapped until the 1950s, using seismic equipment. Yet here's a map from 1513, showing details that shouldn't be visible. Piri-Reis wrote that he compiled it from older maps, some dating back to Alexander the Great's time, others even older. But that just pushes the mystery back further. Who made the original maps? Who had the technology to map Antarctica when it wasn't frozen? The linguistic evidence adds another layer. Language shouldn't appear fully formed. It should evolve gradually. Simple sounds becoming complex words, becoming grammatical structures over thousands of years. But the oldest written languages we've found, Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, appear suddenly, with complete grammatical complexity. No primitive precursors, no evolution from simple to complex, just sophisticated languages emerging as if from nowhere. And ancient myths consistently claim language was a divine gift. The Egyptian god Thoth gave writing. The Sumerian god Enki gave language. The Mayan gods taught glyphs. Across cultures, the same claim. Language didn't evolve, it was taught. Modern linguistics struggle with this. The origin of language is one of the field's great unsolved mysteries. We have theories about gradual evolution from grunts to grammar, but the evidence doesn't really support it. The earliest languages we can study are already fully formed, complex, capable of expressing abstract concepts. Then there's the artwork. Cave paintings and petroglyphs worldwide, showing figures that look disturbingly modern. In Val Camonica, Italy, rock art depicts figures wearing what appear to be helmets or spacesuits. In Australia, Aboriginal paintings show beings called Wandjina, with large heads and no mouths, surrounded by halos. In Utah, petroglyphs show humanoid figures wearing elaborate gear. In Ecuador, ancient carvings depict people in what look like aircraft or vehicles. Mainstream archaeology interprets these as shamanic visions, spiritual experiences, symbolic representations of gods or ancestors, not literal depictions. But why do visions worldwide produce such specific similarities? Why do shamanic trances in Australia produce the same helmeted figures as rock art in Italy? Why do spiritual symbols in Ecuador look like vehicles? Either the human psyche generates these images universally through some unknown neurological pattern, or people worldwide were describing something they saw, something real, something they didn't have vocabulary for, but tried to capture in images. As researcher Igor Berner documents in his analysis of global patterns, the similarities extend beyond mythology and architecture to scientific knowledge. Ancient cultures worldwide demonstrate understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that shouldn't exist without advanced tools. They track planetary motions, calculate solar and lunar cycles, build structures requiring precise measurements and complex geometry, all independently, all through patient observation and brilliant deduction? Or did they have help? Did they have teachers showing them shortcuts, revealing patterns, demonstrating techniques? The mainstream explanation requires believing that dozens of ancient civilizations independently made the same discoveries, encoded the same mathematical constants, developed the same building techniques, created the same mythologies,
and preserved the same astronomical knowledge without any contact or shared source.
The alternative explanation requires believing that something or someone provided knowledge to multiple cultures, either through direct contact or through a shared ancient source now lost, either through intervention or through accessing preserved information from an earlier advanced civilization that predated recorded history. Both explanations require accepting something remarkable. Either ancient humans were far more capable than we give them credit for, or they had access to knowledge from sources we haven't seriously considered. And here's what bothers me. When European colonizers encountered indigenous cultures with advanced knowledge, they consistently dismissed it, refused to accept that primitive people could possess sophisticated understanding, imposed frameworks of superstition and ignorance over carefully preserved traditions, destroyed libraries, burned codices, suppressed oral histories. All because the knowledge didn't fit their assumptions about which cultures could possess scientific understanding. How much was lost? How many accounts of ancient teachers were dismissed as primitive mythology? How many technical descriptions were categorized as religious fantasy? How many precise observations were ignored because colonizers couldn't believe indigenous people were capable of such sophistication? The Maya tracked Venus with accuracy matching modern astronomy. They calculated solar eclipses centuries in advance. They developed a calendrical system so precise it required less correction than the European calendar of the same period. Yet Spanish conquistadors burned their books as devil worship, destroyed millennia of accumulated knowledge because it threatened religious orthodoxy. What did those books contain? What knowledge was lost? What descriptions of teachers and sky people were eliminated before they could be seriously studied? We'll never know, because institutional power decided what counted as legitimate knowledge. And anything that challenged approved narratives got categorized as primitive superstition, gets dismissed, gets buried, gets forgotten. But the patterns remain, the architecture stands, the myths persist. The anomalies keep appearing no matter how hard we try to explain them away, and the more we discover, the more the standard timeline fails to accommodate the evidence. Something happened in humanity's past that we don't understand. Something that left traces worldwide. Something that ancient cultures try to preserve in stories, in structures, in traditions passed down through generations. They kept telling us the same thing. Teachers came from the sky. Knowledge was given. Civilization was taught. And we keep dismissing them. Keep insisting they couldn't possibly mean what they said. Keep reinterpreting their clear statements into comfortable metaphors that don't threaten our assumptions. But what if they meant exactly what they said? What if the myths are memory? What if the gods were real in some form we haven't seriously considered? When every ancient culture on Earth preserves stories of beings from the sky who brought knowledge, built monuments, and shaped civilization, we face two options. Either humanity suffered a collective delusion that coincidentally produced identical narratives worldwide, or our ancestors were describing something real that we've forgotten. If it's delusion, we need to explain why the same false story appears everywhere with the same specific details, why the same technologies, why the same knowledge, why the same architectural techniques, why the same astronomical understanding. If it's memory, then everything changes. Our history isn't what we thought. Our origins aren't what we believed. And the teachers our ancestors described weren't imaginary, which means they might have left more than myths, more than monuments, more than knowledge. They might have left instructions, warnings, messages encoded in structures we haven't fully decoded yet. information preserved in traditions we've dismissed as superstition. And if that's true, if our ancestors were trying to tell us something important about who we are and where we came from, then we need to stop dismissing their testimony, stop reinterpreting their words, stop filtering everything through assumptions that close off possibilities before we've honestly examined the evidence. We need to make a choice. Accept the comfortable narrative that requires ignoring mountains of uncomfortable evidence, or embrace the uncomfortable possibility that human history is far stranger, far older, and far more connected to forces beyond our planet than institutions want us to believe. The evidence exists. The patterns persist. The choice is ours. What will we believe? And why does it matter? We've examined ancient tablets that predate Genesis. We've explored Vatican corridors where documents remain sealed. We've decoded creation myths that sound disturbingly like genetic engineering. We've traced patterns across continents showing impossible knowledge and identical stories. Now we face the question every viewer must answer for themselves. When institutions that control knowledge tell us what to believe about our origins, how do we decide what's true? So we've discovered that every ancient culture preserves the same story. Beings from the sky, teachers who brought knowledge, gods who shaped civilization. Either humanity suffered a collective delusion, or our ancestors were describing something real. But that binary choice is too simple, because the real question isn't what to believe. It's how to evaluate evidence when institutions have incentives to protect certain narratives. Let's start with what we know for certain. Facts that no one disputes. Genesis borrowed from older Mesopotamian sources. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's mainstream biblical scholarship.
The Enuma Elish predates Genesis by over 1,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative with details matching Noah's story point by point. Academic journals document these connections. They're verified, established, undeniable. Ancient cultures possessed sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge. The Sumerians tracked precession cycles, requiring 26,000 years of observation. The Maya calculated Venus's orbit with modern accuracy. The Egyptians encoded pi and the golden ratio in the pyramids. This knowledge exists. It's measurable. It's real. Global mythological patterns describe sky beings teaching humanity. Not vague similarities, specific parallels. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy. The same skills attributed to divine teachers across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The patterns are documented. The similarities are undeniable. Institutions have historically suppressed information challenging orthodox narratives. Galileo, the Index of Forbidden Books, the destruction of indigenous libraries, the Vatican's secret archive that remains secret until 2019. This isn't speculation, it's historical record. Those are the facts, what we can verify, what exists regardless of interpretation. Now let's acknowledge the legitimate objections. Because mainstream academics aren't stupid, they're not all part of some grand conspiracy. They raise valid concerns that deserve serious consideration. Where's the physical evidence for extraterrestrial contact? If advanced beings visited Earth and taught humanity, where are their tools, their technology, their remains? We find stone tools from 1 million years ago, but nothing suggesting visitors from space. That's a real problem for ancient astronaut theories. You can't hand-wave away the complete absence of physical artifacts.
Human capacity for innovation is extraordinary. We invented writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture without needing outside teachers. Every one of those advances can be explained through patient observation, brilliant insight, and accumulated knowledge passed through generations. Independent innovation is not only possible, it's documented throughout history. We don't need ancient aliens to explain human achievement. Linguistic ambiguities allow multiple interpretations. Cuneiform symbols can be read different ways. Context shapes meaning. Cultural assumptions influence translation. When Zecharia Sitchin translates Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came, trained linguists show how his grammar is wrong. That's legitimate criticism. His translations are often flawed. Pattern recognition can produce false correlations. The human brain sees patterns everywhere, faces in clouds, conspiracies in coincidences, grand narratives in random data. Just because multiple cultures have creation myths doesn't mean they're describing real events. Shared psychological architecture might generate similar stories without shared experiences. These are good arguments, strong arguments. They deserve respect, not dismissal. So, here's where it gets interesting. Because both sides can be simultaneously correct about different aspects. Sitchin's translations are often wrong, but that doesn't invalidate every question he asked. Mainstream explanations account for most human achievements, but most isn't all. Some anomalies remain unexplained. Some patterns resist easy categorization. The problem is institutional mechanisms that control which questions get asked. Peer review protects quality, but also enforces orthodoxy. Grant funding supports incremental research, not paradigm challenges. Academic careers depend on publishable results within accepted frameworks. Researchers who question fundamental assumptions risk professional suicide. This system has benefits. It filters junk science. It maintains standards. It prevents every crackpot theory from polluting discourse. But it also creates blind spots.
It makes certain questions unprofessional to ask. It punishes unconventional thinking. It protects paradigms beyond when evidence warrants protection. Thomas Kuhn documented this pattern. Paradigms don't shift because new evidence convinces the establishment. They shift because the establishment retires, and a new generation accepts what the old guard rejected. Continental drift, heliocentrism, germ theory, each faced decades of resistance before becoming consensus. So when we ask what's at stake in debates about human origins, we're not just talking about ancient history. We're talking about fundamental questions. Are we products of purposeless evolution, random mutations filtered by survival? Or are we potentially designed, created with intention, shaped by forces we don't understand? This matters. It shapes how we understand human nature, human potential, human purpose. Whether we're cosmic accidents or cosmic experiments, whether we're alone in the universe or connected to something larger, whether our destiny is self-determined or written in our genes by others. Religious institutions have enormous investments in specific origin stories. If Genesis is edited mythology, borrowed from pagan sources, if Adam and Eve weren't real, if creation didn't happen as described, then divine revelation becomes questionable. Biblical authority erodes. Theological foundations crack. Churches don't need conspiracy to suppress inconvenient evidence. They just need to interpret findings through theological lenses. Genesis borrowed from Babylon? That shows universal truth reaching all cultures. Ancient advanced knowledge? That demonstrates God working through all peoples. Global flood myths?
evidence supporting Noah's historical reality. Every discovery gets recontextualized to preserve doctrine. But here's what people misunderstand. Questioning official narratives doesn't require embracing ancient astronaut theories. There's middle ground.
You can acknowledge mysteries without claiming aliens. You can admit we don't understand everything without jumping to extraordinary explanations. You can recognize that mainstream narratives have holes without filling those holes with speculation. Intellectual honesty requires holding multiple possibilities simultaneously. Maybe ancient humans were more innovative than we credit. Maybe some knowledge came from earlier lost civilizations. Maybe both natural evolution and unknown interventions played roles. Maybe we don't know yet, and shouldn't pretend we do. The danger is confirmation bias. Believers see ancient astronauts everywhere. Every artifact becomes evidence. Every myth becomes history. Every anomaly proves visitation. That's not investigation. That's predetermined conclusions searching for support. But skeptics do the same thing in reverse. Every anomaly becomes fraud or misinterpretation. Every unexplained artifact gets dismissed without investigation. Every challenge to orthodoxy gets rejected reflexively. That's not skepticism. That's defensive orthodoxy. Real inquiry requires vulnerability, willingness to be wrong, openness to evidence regardless of implications, commitment to truth over comfort. And here's what should humble everyone. What seemed impossible becomes routine. Powered flight was fantasy until the Wright brothers. Space travel was fiction until Gagarin. Genetic engineering was science fiction until CRISPR. Artificial intelligence was impossible until it wasn't. Technology advances. Plausibility shifts. What our grandparents called magic, we call medicine. What ancient peoples might have witnessed and tried to describe, using available vocabulary, we might now recognize as technology, if we read their accounts honestly. Maybe ancient descriptions of flying vehicles aren't mythological chariots, but attempts to describe actual aircraft. Maybe glowing gods aren't divine beings, but people in illuminated suits. Maybe divine weapons aren't supernatural power, but advanced technology. Maybe sky people weren't gods, but visitors. Or maybe not. Maybe it's all mythology, and we're reading modern knowledge backwards into ancient ignorance. The point is, we don't know. And admitting that matters more than defending preferred explanations. So what should you believe? Here's my framework. Evaluate evidence honestly. Acknowledge what we can verify. Admit what remains mysterious. Hold interpretations lightly. Question institutions without becoming conspiracy theorist. Respect expertise without surrendering independent thought. The tablets exist. They predate Genesis. They describe the Anunnaki. Those are facts. What the Anunnaki were, what the texts mean, what actually happened. Those require interpretation. And interpretation involves assumptions about what's possible. Religious institutions restricted knowledge for centuries. That's documented. Whether they're still hiding crucial information, whether they know something we don't, whether their restrictions serve legitimate privacy or illegitimate control. Those are questions worth asking, without claiming definitive answers. Ancient cultures preserved sophisticated knowledge. That's measurable. Whether they gained it through genius observation, inherited it from lost civilizations, or received it from external teachers, Those are possibilities worth investigating without premature conclusions. Human genetics show unusual patterns. That's scientific fact. Whether those patterns result from natural evolution, intentional engineering, or something we haven't considered, those are questions worth exploring without forcing answers. The evidence doesn't point in one direction. It points in multiple directions simultaneously, which means the truth is probably more complex than any single explanation captures. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just accept what institutions tell you, but don't blindly reject them either. Investigate primary sources. Examine evidence yourself. Study the patterns. Think critically about who controls narratives and why. Ask uncomfortable questions. Pursue truth wherever it leads, but maintain intellectual humility. Distinguish between what you know and what you believe, between what you can demonstrate and what you suspect, between verified facts and interpretive frameworks. The Vatican has documents you can't access. That's fact. Whether those documents contain shocking revelations about human origins, that's speculation. The distinction matters. Ancient texts describe beings with advanced knowledge. That's verifiable. Whether those beings were extraterrestrial visitors, advanced humans from lost civilizations, or mythological projections, that's interpretation. Acknowledge the difference. Global patterns exist in mythology and architecture. That's observable. Whether those patterns indicate shared teachers, cultural diffusion, or psychological universals, that requires careful analysis, not premature conviction. We've spent 90 minutes examining evidence that institutions control knowledge, that ancient texts contain mysteries, that human origins involve unexplained elements, not to convince you of ancient astronauts, not to make you reject mainstream science, but to show you that the story we've been told is incomplete, that mysteries remain, that questions deserve investigation. What you do with that information is your choice. You can dismiss everything we've discussed, return to comfortable certainty that mainstream narratives are complete and accurate. That's a legitimate choice. You can embrace alternative theories, decide Sitchin was right and institutions are hiding truth. That's also a choice, though one requiring evidence beyond what we've presented. Or you can do something harder. Live with uncertainty. Investigate independently. Question everything, including your own conclusions. Seek truth without claiming to possess it. Acknowledge mysteries without inventing answers. That's the choice. Not between specific explanations, between intellectual courage and comfortable certainty. The tablets remain, scattered across museums and archives, written in languages most people can't read, interpreted by institutions with invested interests. They contain information about human origins, about beings called the Anunnaki, about creation, knowledge, and the dawn of civilization. What they actually say, what it means, what really happened. Those questions remain open. Not because we lack evidence, but because we lack consensus about how to interpret evidence when it challenges fundamental assumptions. So investigate, question, think. Don't let institutions tell you what to believe.
But don't let alternative researchers do it either. Decide for yourself based on evidence, reason, and intellectual honesty. The story of human origins is far stranger than we've been told. That much is certain. What it actually is? That's the question we all need to keep asking. Because the truth matters. Not just for history, for understanding who we are, what we're capable of, and what possibilities remain open. For recognizing that we might be more than random accidents. For considering that our ancestors might have been wiser than we give them credit for. For acknowledging that the universe might be more mysterious, more populated, more connected than institutional narratives admit. The tablets speak, if we're brave enough to listen. The patterns persist, if we're honest enough to see them. The questions remain, if we're humble enough to admit we don't have all the answers. What are they hiding? Maybe everything. Maybe nothing. Maybe the wrong question entirely. Maybe the real question is, what are we hiding from ourselves? What truths are we unwilling to consider because they threaten our understanding of reality? The choice is yours. Choose wisely. Choose honestly. Choose truth over comfort.
And never stop questioning. Because the moment we stop asking, we stop discovering. And the moment we stop discovering, we stop being human. Last selection.